left off in the last video, I was discussing what power plant I wanted to run in the Conquest, and I showed you this 5.7 Hemi block that I had left over from another project. The plan was to use this block and another set of 6.1 Hemi heads that I got extra when I bought that motor, which I bought for my 71 Demon, which you can see over here to my left. So with being on a fairly low budget on this car, I started looking for used parts that would do the trick but not break the bank. But while I was searching, I came across a complete 6.1 loan block. And it was in pretty rough shape, but it was at a price I just couldn't refuse. And that gave me the 6.1 crank I was looking for and the rods, plus a 6.1 block, which is stronger and has a bigger bore, not to mention another set of heads and rockers that I could use in another project. So after buying another 6.1, I just decided to table the 5.7 for another project on down the road. And then I started doing some mental math, and I realized that the motor I really want to put in the Conquest I already had sitting right here. And also, after doing a lot of research, I decided I want something a little more radical in the Demon than what I need in the Conquest. So it's probably going to need different rods, maybe a stroker, and definitely a bigger cam. Because the cam in this motor is an Arrington SR2B. Now that's the smaller of their two cam grinds. They have another that's higher lift, but basically the same duration. And it's in just a stock 6.1 short block. And on top of that, we have 6.1 heads that have a mild port job, which would work well with the 6.1 displacement and with the smaller cam. And to top everything off, I have this 5.7 Eagle intake that's off of like a 09 and up 5.7 motor. And it matches the ports pretty well in the 6.1. I do have to run spacers between the intake and the heads because there's a clearance issue at the front of the intake here and the block. So since I already have this intake, it's going to be a little bit cheaper than buying the 6.1 intakes because they want a pretty penny for those, even though I am buying the spacers. Normally I would build the spacers, but I'm on a time crunch with this motor, so I went ahead and bought them. And I'm also hoping that this intake will be a good bit lighter than the 6.1s. The 6.1s have an aluminum intake, and this one's plastic, so it should be a lot lighter, and I want to keep as much weight off the nose of this car as possible because we are adding some with this big old iron Hemi. So now I've got most of the kinks worked out on what motor I want on the Conquest, and in the last video I discussed what transmission I wanted to run. And I said I'd probably run a TR6060 out of a new Challenger, and that's what I've got. I got a pretty good deal on this, so I went ahead and bought it. It did come with a bell housing, so that helps also. I will have to be buying a shifter. The Challengers, the shifter came off the back, and it kind of had like a cantilever type shifter. And there's two companies that make a shifter for this, but one of them's twice the price of the other one. So I'm probably going to go with the cheaper one, just because I am trying to not blow the budget completely out of proportion on this car. Alright, so now that we got all the details out of the way, it's time to get to work. The first thing I need to do is go ahead and start mocking up everything on the engine, mate it to the transmission, and try to swing it over in the car and see just how much we're going to have to cut out to make this thing fit. I know I'm going to have to cut out the transmission tunnel, and we might be cutting on the firewall too. The main thing is just trying to get an idea of where the engine's going to sit and what all is going to have to move in order for it to sit there. Alright, so I got the engine over here to the car, and I've got pretty much everything mocked up that I might need to have on the motor just to see if I have any clearance issues. I did decide to leave the balancer and intake off for now. I'll probably just set the intake up there when I get it in here and get it supported from underneath. And I put these headers on just to see if there was any clearance with the starter. These headers were designed for a car with the starter on the other side, but there isn't any clearance issues. In fact, I've got about 2 inches or so. Not sure if these headers will work with this car still. It's going to be really tight. I got the steering box on this side, so it's going to be, a pretty tight fit. And I'm not sure if I want to cut these up yet or just get some like factory style SRT manifolds and maybe even cut them up and make custom headers. So that's still up in the air. We'll have to make that decision once I get everything in here and cut out the firewall and the transmission tunnel. But for now, I'm going to try to swing this over in here, see how close we can get to getting it in the car, and do a little measuring, a little marking, and probably start cutting up stuff. So one thing I wanted to do before I started mocking everything up is I went through and got the car level. I took a 2x4 and stretched it across the car at basically the same point, square with the car. And I just took a normal bubble level, put it on top of the 2x4. I made sure the 2x4 was really straight. And that way, since everything's level, I can, measure off the floor, or if I'm using an angle finder or something like that, I'll know at least the car is sitting as close to level as it can be. And even though, like, if I measure off the floor, I know the floor is not perfect in here, but it's close enough because I'll have just a little bit of adjustment in my mounts and everything. So that would be close enough to get the engine where it needs to be. After several attempts at trying to get the engine and trans into the car, it was apparent that the TR6060 wouldn't even be close to fitting without cutting out most of the trans tunnel and some of the firewall. So I separated the engine from the trans and dropped it in just to get an idea of where I needed to make my cuts. Okay, so it almost fits. Right now the center line of the axle is right behind cylinders 3 and 4, so I really want to push it back as far back as I can. And I've got the oil pan clearance for it, so I'll try to do that. And I really kind of want to get it lower too. The plan right now is to keep the stock hood, so in order to do that, it looks like we're going to have to come down, and again, I've got the room for that except for the steering box. The steering box is in the way of the headers, it looks like. I would like to keep the steering box for now, just because I don't have room in the budget to make it a rack and pinion. Plus, it's going to take a lot of engineering and a lot of time that I don't have. So I may be able to squeak the headers past the steering box, just passing right over to the right of it. We'll have to see. But for now, I think that's a good place to mark the bell housing so that I'll have plenty clearance for the transmission. Also, where it is right now, I have the engine shifted over towards the passenger side a little bit, and that's actually not that unusual. A lot of cars, especially Mopars, had the engine shifted that way for steering box clearance. It also helps in weight distribution because when you're racing a car, you're usually the only person in it. So when you've got 180 or 200 pounds on the driver's side, it helps to shift the drivetrain over a little bit in order to balance the weight out left to right. So since there's no way I'm fitting the engine and transmission into the car right now without go ahead and cutting some stuff out, I needed to come up with some type of template so I can cut the transmission tunnel out and get everything in there. And so what I did was I made this, which looks pretty primitive, but it's basically just the outline of the transmission tunnel. Everything here is going to give plenty clearance for the transmission itself. So I laid it in the car. This is basically where the firewall was sitting, so I set it back another 2 inches because that's about how much more the engine's going to come back, or really about 1.5 inches, so that'll give me, about a 1/2 inch of clearance. And so I went ahead and marked that. I also marked the firewall, but I'll probably go ahead and cut the transmission tunnel out, then try to swing everything in, and I'll kind of, see what I want to do with the firewall. I need to kind of figure out everything I want to do with the HVAC stuff before I start cutting on the firewall, because I may have to tweak that a little bit, move it around. And so for now, I'm going to cut out the transmission tunnel and try to get everything into the car. Hole in it, but hopefully the transmission will fit. Alright, so I got the transmission back on. Now it's time to slide it in here, see how close it's going to fit. Okay, that's about as good as we're going to get right now. So the engine's definitely going to need to be slid back. It would probably work right now the way it is. I could probably, I can make it work with the stock firewall. But it's still hitting the sway bar right now. The engine's sitting at a little bit too much angle because the yoke on the transmission is actually hitting the drive shaft tunnel. So I'm going to have to do some more surgery on that. I was trying to retain where the drive shaft and transmission tunnel is because that's where the e-brake mounts, but I can always move the e-brake back. That's no big deal. So just more cutting on that. I'm going to have to move it back anyway because where it's hitting is about where I want my shifter to be. So probably end up cutting another good 6 or 8 inches out of that. I think it's about as good as it's going to get for tonight. It's time to call it a night, and after work tomorrow we'll pick it back up. Alright, so I've spent a lot of time with the car and kind of moving things around, measuring everything, trying to figure out exactly where I want to cut the firewall, because once I cut it, you know, it's hard to go back and add material back. So measure twice, cut once. And right now, one of the biggest obstacles is the factory HVAC stuff. So this part here, this bolts on the far right side of the firewall. It actually bolts to the kick panel right here. And it has the blower motor, and it also takes in air from the cowl. And then if you switch to recirculation, this door opens and it recirculates the air throughout the cabin. And the plan is right now to keep this where it's going. I can cut the firewall right about here, move it back, and it's not going to interfere with this much at all. The only thing it will interfere with is right here where it hooks to this part. These sort of hook together, let's see, like this. And what I'll probably do is just offset them a bit, probably not that much, about like that. And whenever I hook them together right here, I'm just having to make sort of a little offset here. Won't be quite as efficient, but it'll get the job done. This box has the evaporator for the AC, and that's basically all it does. I think it sits about like that. So this will be pushed back as far as I can, as far as I need to get the motor where it needs to be. This right here connects to this box down here. This box, so air comes through the evaporator, then in right here. This sets pretty much right in the middle of the dash, and it has the heater core, and it directs air either through the heater core or past it if you don't have the heater on. And it puts air, it has all the switches and everything to switch air to defrost, dash vents, or down to the floor. And I know I'm going to have issues with this box down here because it's already hitting the transmission, and once the bell housing is pushed back even farther, I'm going to have a lot of clearance issues. So I'll try to keep the modifications to a minimum because, like I say, I am on a tight time frame, and the more I modify, the more time it takes. But I'll have to do what I have to do to make everything fit right. Okay, so we have another potential problem area right here. There's a lot going on in this corner of the engine bay. So master cylinder goes here, throttle cable goes here, the throttle pedal actually mounts down here somewhere, and then right here where this hole is, that's where the steering column passes through. I went ahead and removed it. So in order to get the engine moved back, I'm going to have to cut it and have clearance, you know, for the coils and for the valve cover, head, everything. So there's a lot of clearance issues going on. Of course, the engine's going to have to be moved back, and I don't really want to move the master cylinder because then I'd have to move my pedals. It looks like I'm already having to move the throttle pedal, so I don't want to, you know, change too much of the pedal heights because I want to be able to, you know, heel toe downshift, things like that. So when you start messing around with that stuff, it actually messes around with being able to drive the car. So we want to minimize that as much as possible. So I'm going to make my cut right up here, and then around here under the master cylinder mount, and then back up here, and then to this seam weld. I'm going to cut all the way across right up under this seam weld. There's another like firewall right here under this, and it brings up another clearance issue because I'm most likely going to be cutting into this right here above the seam weld for intake clearance, and all of the wiper linkage is under here. So the wiper motor is over there, and then it drives this wiper, and then there's another linkage that drives this wiper. So I have to make sure whenever I clearance for the intake, nothing is interfering with the wipers. So it's a lot of stuff that wants to be in the same area, and the goal is to just make everything fit as well as it can and not be interfering with each other. Once I had marked where I wanted to make my cut, I removed the engine and trans and then cut out the firewall with an angle grinder. Alright, so now that we got this out of the way, I can go ahead and put the motor back in for like the 4th or 5th time, whatever it is. And I should be able to actually set it back to where I want it. Hey, Hoss. Alright, I got the engine and trans back in the car, and I put some wooden blocks underneath where the crossmember is and then where the engine mounts go on the engine itself, and they're about the right height. I do think I'm going to bring the entire engine and trans up just a 1/2 inch. That's just for steering box clearance because there's not a lot right now. There's like 1/8 of an inch. And so bringing up another 1/2 inch, 5/8 of an inch with the polyurethane mounts that I'm planning on running. Shouldn't be a whole lot of movement, so that should give me enough clearance between the headers and the head and the steering box. So now what I have to work on is making the intake fit. As you can see, there's a good 2.5 or 3 inch area right here where it's hitting like the cowl area where the wipers go in and out and where the AC system sucks in fresh air. So I should be able to notch that and not have to modify the wiper system. I'll just have to cycle that wiper system, and if we have any clearance issues, I'll have to modify the wipers because I'd rather modify them than move the engine forward. Alright, so I made a couple cardboard templates. I just set the intake down on the cardboard and just got a rough outline, giving me plenty of clearance of where I need to make my cut, and then I transferred it to the car here, so now it's time to cut it out and see if the intake will fit. Alright, so it's looking pretty good. It is a little clearance issue here where this pinch weld, where the firewall met this cowl area. I'll probably just trim the pinch weld here where they went together and just seam weld it up, and that should give me a good bit of clearance. And I might do the same on the other side too, just to make it look a little better and match the other side. But other than that, everything's looking good. I think I should have plenty of clearance with the cuts I made here. Just have to patch that up and make sure before I patch it that there's not any problems with the wiper functions. Now that I had enough metal cut away, I could start deciding exactly where to position the engine and trans in the car, which means I needed to test fit the headers I had to see if they would even be close to working in the car. So after much more looking and trying to make the headers fit, they're just not going to work with the configuration we have. So what I'm probably going to end up doing is just cutting the collectors off and then cutting the flanges off and going complete custom tubes from there. It is going to hurt us on our time frame, but it's something that has to be done, so I might as well go ahead and do it. So speaking of the time crunch, even though I don't have all the parts to build my motor mounts, they should be in pretty soon, so I can go ahead and get the parts that I will know I need. So I'm going to go ahead and make the plate that bolts to the engine. This is the other 6.1 I bought for my Demon, and this is actually the first time I've opened it up, and I know it looks like it's been at the bottom of the sea, but actually inside it's in really good condition. I was pleasantly surprised. Alright, so I went ahead and cut my little square for this out of plywood, and I actually use a lot of plywood. I have an abundance of it because we use it to build swimming pool walls, but also I can cut it on a miter saw, and it's good and square after I do that, and it's a lot easier to mark whenever you're transferring it on the metal. And I use it a lot when I'm doing like off-road stuff and big stuff like the cab over I'm building, because it's usually like you can make it the same thickness as the metal, so whenever you get done building whatever you're trying to mock up out of plywood, then you can actually just use the actual plywood to transfer it onto your metal, and it's the same measurements and everything. And another advantage is you can go ahead and build the entire assembly out of plywood, and it's a lot cheaper than metal. So you can build it, and it's got some structural ability to it, so you can clamp it on or bolt it on, do whatever, and you can actually see how it's going to work before you make it out of metal. So it's not quite as cheap as cardboard, but in some cases it's actually a lot more useful. Alright, so now I need to mark the holes, and instead of taking out a tape and measuring all four corners, try to get the holes just right, I'm going to do it the quick and easy way. And I'm just going to set it on here, get all the corners about even, You can get it really close, just feeling of it with your fingers. Then I just take my dead blow and give it a good smack. Check it, make sure it hasn't moved. It shouldn't. And you can see you've got all 4 holes marked and ready to be drilled. Alright, so once again I've got the engine in kind of the position where I want it, and I was going to go ahead and make some mock-up motor mounts out of plywood, but I got to looking again and the engine is just too close to the steering box, and when I had the intake on it the other night, it was looking like I was going to have to cut a hole in the hood. So I think I'm going to go ahead and make the decision to just get rid of the steering box and do a rack and pinion setup. But for now, I just need to tear the steering box out and get it out of the way. With the steering box out of the way, I was able to position the engine exactly where I wanted it, and it freed up more room to route my headers. So with the engine in its proper place, I turned my attention to the transmission crossmember. That'll help get some of the weight out of the car too. Alright, I've been working on the transmission crossmember. This is the first design I came up with, and it uses the factory style Challenger mount, and it has enough room here for the exhaust to pass through above the mount here, but it just didn't have enough ground clearance that I wanted, because I would just be high centering on everything since it's pretty much smack dab in the middle of the car and it sits lower than everything else. So I scrapped this and I went to another design. I went ahead and made it because I didn't have time to film. We're on a pretty tight schedule. And this is what I have. It kicks up here for exhaust clearance. It'll pass through right there. And this piece here just bolts directly to that. So there's no rubber mounts here to make it have to come way down under the car. And in order to take up vibrations, I'll be running a bushing like this. This is the same bushing I'm going to be running on the motor mounts. And the bushings will go into these here. So the bushings on the transmission crossmember will slide into this piece here. And then this goes around the frame rails. That's a part of the unibody, and it'll bolt through the frame rail. And in order to keep the frame rail from squishing whenever I bolt it, I'm going to take these spacers here that I made. This is just like a 1/2 inch ID, like 16 gauge tubing that I found, and this will go through the frame in holes that I drill, and then I'll weld it around on each side, and that'll keep it from crushing the frame rail. Alright, I made my mock-up motor mounts out of plywood, and now I'm trying to make them out of metal. And the plywood mounts, I really can't go by them to a T, because after I made my transmission mounts, some things kind of moved around a bit. So I'm just using them kind of as a guideline. So I already have the half of the motor mount that bolts to the motor made, and it has 2 legs that come out, and it'll sandwich this polyurethane mount, which this is the same type stuff that I'm using on the transmission crossmember. And so now this right here will mount to the frame using a sleeve, just like I did on the transmission crossmember. Got these plates here. This is where my sleeve will go into, and you can see I bent this leg over here. And what I'm doing on the original way that the motor mounted on the Conquest is it just had this flat motor mount that mounted to the front crossmember here. And it just had 2 bolts that mounted the motor to the frame, and that was okay for that little 4-cylinder, but this thing puts out probably more than twice the torque. So what I'm doing is I'm adding another piece that comes up from here and then across the top, and I'll put another bolt down here, and that's where these little legs come from. They will go on to the top of the motor mount here, and you see I have them offset there. And not only does it give it a little more stability, but it also gives me more clearance to put my bolt down through the top. Okay, so I put everything in the car, made sure everything fit right, put the bushing in here, and then I tacked these 3 plates together where everything was sitting. And that way I know that everything slides in good and bolts down just like it should. And I marked these. I didn't want to tack these welds in here with the polyurethane bushing sitting in there, just didn't want to melt it. So I made sure I marked it up good. It was a good tight fit, so it didn't move around any. And now it's just time to weld it all up. Alright, Alright, so I got the driver's side motor mount completely welded up and bolted in, and you can see the extra bolt that I put on right there, right up top here. And my plan was to drill that out and then weld a nut on the back side, but there was already a nut in this location that was just, I think it was just unused in the stock car, but it was a pretty heavy nut even though it only had like a, I think it was like an 8mm thread. I was able to drill out the nut and then tap it for this 3/8 bolt. So that's going to be a little more strength for this Hemi compared to the stock 4-cylinder motor mounts. So that one's good to go, and now it's time to work on the passenger side. Okay, so I have half of the motor mount for the passenger side made. This is the one that bolts to the engine cross member, and I did the opposite thing of what I did on the other side. It just worked out better for the one to bolt to the car. It captures the polyurethane mount, and the one that bolts to the engine will actually have this, the insert in there and a piece of tubing, just like the other side, but opposite. Another thing on this side, I went ahead and put 2 extra bolts, and there was, the way the cross member was made, there were 2 flats, and I was able to come off of the mount here and drill 2 holes, and then I'm going to put some 3/8 bolts through, and I'm going to try to weld the nuts on the back side if I have room, and that should be good to go. They'll have 2 extra bolts, and that way it'll keep up with the torque of this Hemi. Also on the tabs here, I had to bend these for bolt hole clearance, and that goes to the existing holes that were already in the cross member. And you might can see I had to clearance the welds too, just to make everything fit and don't have any interference with the washers that are on the bolts. And so this is done. The next thing will be to get the mount that bolts to the engine, and we'll have this insert in it, and then I will be done as far as mounting the engine goes. Okay, so I've got the lower mount in here now, and now what I have to do is try to get from that plate that's bolted to the motor to the sleeve that's around the polyurethane bushing. And as you can tell, there's a pretty good offset here. So the challenge is trying to get the plate that goes in between the two and get it at least a little bit of the load pushed over towards the back side of that plate on the motor, even though most of the load is going in line with this mount, since the engine's trying to twist, and that's what these engine mounts are there to, that's their job, is to keep the engine from twisting. But I still want a little bit of the load shared between these bolts and the ones over here. And this is a 1/4-inch plate. I went up in size on the plates on the motor. I did that on the other side too. This other stuff is 3/16, so this plate's a little bit beefy, so I shouldn't have any issues with this being so offset here, but I'm still going to kind of dogleg off on this inside plate at least, and maybe the outside plate too. I have to keep in mind these bolts, and I need plenty of clearance in order to get the bolts in here. And in fact, I don't know if you can tell, but that top front corner, the bolt is almost directly over the polyurethane mount and the sleeve, so I actually had to make that bolt a little bit shorter than the other ones in order to be able to get it in. So a few little things to work around here, but everything should work out right. I did go ahead and cut a couple plates out right here. I got them just welded together so that they'll be all symmetrical. And obviously they're a little big, but what I'm about to do is take the poly bushing out and then put these on, just slide them up in there, and then I'll be able to mark the hole where these goes, and then I'll drill it out with a hole saw to 1 3/4 so that the sleeve will slide right through there. And then I can take everything out and kind of figure out where I want it to go, and it'll be a lot easier to just put those plates in and then probably tack them right there with everything put together. That way when I take it out and then I can weld everything up, it should go right back to where I had it whenever I tacked it up. I'm going to slip these plates in here and then mark the hole. I'm going to flush it up with the front side since the back is getting dog-legged. That's pretty much flush. I'm going to use a piece of tungsten to mark it. I like using tungsten in tight places because it's a lot more compact than like a Sharpie. And you can use tungsten because it's harder than steel. So if you got a good piece of sharpened tungsten from when you've been TIG welding, then you can run it around a couple times, and then you can see it leaves a nice little score line that shows you exactly where the edge of the hole is. Okay, so I got this plate here tacked in. This one's just kind of free floating here. So now I gotta decide what to do with this plate. Obviously, I'm going to need some clearance for my washer and my bolt here. And I need to get it about right here. Even where it's at right now, there's probably going to be some clearance issue with the weld, just like that other mount that I had. And I can just clearance that. So I think for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to leave this one straight. It should be plenty strong. Obviously, I'll have to bob off the excess here just so to make it look better. And I may add a gusset under here just for a little added strength. So that's probably overkill, but I always say overkill is underrated anyway. So we'll do that, and then the motor mount should be done. Okay, here it is all welded up. In fact, it's just freshly welded up. It's still burning hot, but you can see the gusset I added there, and everything's pretty much fully welded, except what I couldn't reach with the TIG torch, but that's okay. It's got plenty of weld to, not come apart. So now the next thing is let it cool down and put it in, and that will be everything as far as getting the engine mounted in place. Alright, I got the motor mounts in. Everything is tightened down. Motor's not moving anywhere, so that's it for mounting the motor and transmission. And the best part is the hood will now close and latch. There is a little bit of clearance issue between the brace that runs under the hood in the middle and the intake, but I should be able to just clearance it right here. If I'm able to, I can just beat that in with a hammer and probably keep a little bit of the structure there. But if worst comes to worst, I'll just notch this piece out here. I'm sure all of this is enough structure. So the biggest question mark now as to hood clearance is what throttle body I use. Some of them have a sensor coming up here and sticking way up. I'm definitely not going to be able to use one of them without cutting a hole in the hood. So I'm going to try to find the lowest profile option I have for throttle body. So that's pretty much it for this video. Part 3 will be coming out soon, and in part 3 we're going to be doing the rack and pinion swap and building the headers. And once I get rack and pinion swap, building the headers, close everything up, the rest is going to be like drive shaft, wiring, stuff like that. So this is a big step in getting this car done. So keep an eye out for part 3 on the Conquest, and in the meantime you can follow me on Instagram. I am Nick Ferris 53, also Racing Rejects. We're on Instagram and Facebook. We're at Racing Rejects. You can email us at theracerejects@gmail.com, and as always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.